At 5:30 a.m. on May 16, 2023, the Kirkland Police Department received a disturbing call. 32-year-old kindergarten teacher Alexia Walters' body was found at her neighbor's house, chopped into pieces. What the investigation uncovered was beyond anything the detectives could have expected. The prime suspect? A 35-year-old Sandra Miller, the sweet and ever-smiling florist. The detectives in charge of the case sensed that they were about to stumble on a case of extreme perfectionist obsession, horror, jealousy, and unbridled rage, which led to this disturbing murder. This is the horrifying tale of a fantasy partner swap that turned sour. Born in 1988, Sandra Miller was always a lover of nature and flowers, especially. As a young lady, she had spent the entirety of her youth studying and learning about flowers. If there was anything she was good at, it was definitely nurturing them, as though she lived for it. During an exclusive interview with one of the city's newspapers, Mary Ann, Sandra's closest friend and regular customer, described her as someone with a sunny personality, just like the sunflower, which was her favorite. She knew them by their names, smell, and even feel, Mary reminisced. She was the town's most trusted florist. She knew the perfect flowers for any occasion. Best believe if you needed any flower on earth, Sandra either had it or knew where to get it. That is how good she was. However charming these qualities may sound, Sandra had a flaw, one that even therapy couldn't solve. She was a perfectionist, an extreme one. She wanted everything about her and everyone around her to be perfect to the core. A single imperfection would make her lose it. She was obsessed with being so perfect that she didn't care if anything went wrong, as long as she had everything her way, a perfect way. But despite all these, it was surprising that she was married to Zach, a delivery truck driver who was nowhere near being perfect. In fact, he was the exact opposite of perfect. At 42, Zach didn't seem to have his life in one piece. He worked different jobs for different reasons, but truck driving was the best thing he could do, and Sandra put up with him without a single complaint all through the 10 years they were married. Zach was not a perfect man, but he tried to give Sandra everything she asked for. He had no knowledge about flowers, but he tried his best to support her flower store and her dream as a florist. He tried to be everything Sandra wanted. According to a few of his friends from the truck garage, he loved her dearly, even more than his trucks, which were the dearest things to him. On the other side of town, another couple's life seemed picture perfect. Ben and Alexia Walker had been married for 5 years. Ben, a 37-year-old transport company manager, and Alexia, a 32-year-old kindergarten teacher who had been married for 5 years, appeared to have it all together. The couple had moved away from their old residence to Kirkland to start a new phase of their lives, especially as they were people who believed strongly in evolving. They loved change and were open to new possibilities. So when Alexia suggested moving down to Kirkland, her husband embraced it with open arms, but they had no idea what they were getting into. Ben was the first to meet with Sandra at her floral shop when he went to get flowers for their new place. Just like Sandra, he was a big lover of flowers as well. He was versed in their knowledge, and they clicked immediately. To Sandra, he was perfect. He knew every flower by their names, feel, and smell. It was as though he was the only person in the world who understood her love and obsession for them. She hadn't met any man like him, and he had good manners too. It was love at first sight for Sandra, who couldn't stop thinking of the man who entered her life through what she loved most. It was big news for Sandra when she discovered that Ben lived just 3 blocks away from her house. One afternoon, after she closed her shop early, she prepared apple pies and took a bouquet of buttercups to visit Ben at his house. But she was met with disappointment when she met his wife, Alexia, at the door instead. Alexia informed her that Ben was not home, and with disappointment written on her face, she dropped her gifts and went back to her house in a sullen mood. The next day after her visit, Ben went to see her at the floral shop to show his gratitude, and soon they were engulfed in a deep conversation about life. For Sandra, it felt like she had finally found her person, and she was determined to get him at all costs. So she started inviting Ben and Alexia to social and personal gatherings. She invited them to dinner on Sundays and a barbecue night on Saturday just to spend more time with Ben. Her thoughts became fully consumed with what a night with Ben would feel like, so she started nursing the idea of having a partner swap. At first, it was hard for her to tell Zach what she wanted, but after spending more time with Ben at her home in the store, She was convinced that getting a no was better than not trying at all. When she finally brought it up to Zach, he was hesitant and uncomfortable with the idea. But after Sandra reassured him that he would also get to be with Alexia, he reluctantly agreed, though not without reservations. This was Sandra's first step. The next step was convincing Ben that the idea was a good one, but to her surprise, Ben agreed quite enthusiastically, and he also agreed to convince his wife. After speaking to his wife about it over dinner, the couple agreed to swap partners for an entire weekend. In order to make the experience even more enjoyable, Sandra planned a getaway trip for them to a secluded lovers' area where the sea was calm and the sun was bright all day. During the trip, Sandra spent all of her time studying Ben, what he likes, his ambitions, everything about him, so she could be with him because he was just too perfect. Much to Sandra's despair, the weekend ended way too quickly, and she had to return to her normal life of being Zach's wife and a mere florist, but she didn't want that anymore. She wanted more than anyone could imagine. After the trip, her behavior towards her husband changed drastically. She became irritable and always angry and complaining. Nothing Zach did made sense to her anymore. She started pointing out his faults every day and talking down on him for not being like other husbands. But through all of these, she always made sure to visit Ben's house for one reason or another. There was always a new flower to talk about every day, and apparently, Ben enjoyed her company to the displeasure of his wife. When Alexia noticed how close Sandra and her husband were beginning to become, she tried talking to him about it. She expressed her displeasure and discontentment about their relationship, but Ben waved it off and tagged their relationship as purely platonic. Things turned sour between Sandra and her husband as well. Her behavior grew worse with time, and the more she hung out around Ben, the more she saw reasons to complain about Zach. She complained about his truck driving and delivery job. She called it dirty and classless. Whenever Zach tried to learn about her flowers, she shunned him, like talking about flowers was a sacred thing that was only supposed to happen between her and Ben. At first, Zach was deeply hurt by his wife's change in behavior. They had been together for over a decade, and he wondered what went wrong until it occurred to him that she had been fussing around Ben. She had started making extra efforts in her dressing and spent more time learning about Ben's hobby while trying to act younger than her age. She even closed down her floral store in order to get surgery to give her a younger look. She wanted to be perfect for Ben. Zach finally noticed that the change in her behavior was due to the partner swap they had engaged in with the Walters. But what he didn't realize was that his wife had fallen head over heels for their neighbor and was willing to do anything to get him. One day, after Zach returned from work and discovered that his wife had gone shopping for date dresses with Ben, he decided he had had enough. He stormed over the Walters' residence, fuming and full of rage. He confronted Zach and accused him of trying to snatch his wife. The men got into a heated argument, leaving Alexia to feel miserable and lonely. After a while, Zach lost his job at the delivery company. He was accused of stealing one of the customer's packages, so he got fired immediately. This was where it all came crashing down on Sandra. She got angry. She despised Zach for losing his job and becoming unemployed. She called him names and stopped acting like his wife due to all of this. Zach became depressed. He stopped talking to people and started acting like a loner. Soon, he was drinking and not returning home. Sandra's life had been turned inside out. He moved out of the house and went far away from Sandra, abandoning the life they had built together. She despised Zach for becoming miserable about the loss of his job and ran to Ben for comfort. She was always with him, at social gatherings, at home, even at her floral shop. It was as though she was holding on to Ben as her last string of hope. Her relationship with Ben made Alexia worried. She tried again and again to talk to her husband about it, but he called her insecure and childish. According to him, the relationship he had with Sandra was a friendship he had never thought he needed. The young couple got into a big fight about this, and Alexia moved out of her home in anger. She couldn't believe that her husband would choose a stranger they'd only known for about 3 months over her. This action brought nothing but joy to Sandra's heart. Now that Alexia was gone, she was free to make her move on Ben, but he wouldn't bulge to her demands easily, so she started lacing his drinks with poison. He might be good at learning about flowers, but she had spent all her life doing it, so she knew what to use that would wear him out slowly, and at the end of the day, render him useless. It was easy for her to do because she quit her floral business to work as Ben's assistant at his firm. This gave them an opportunity to be closer than ever. When Zach saw that Sandra had abandoned her dream to work with Ben, he knew that she was obsessed with him, but he tried not to lose hope and save his family by talking to Sandra once again about her behavior. But instead, she became irate and furious. To her, Ben was a perfect man who could do no wrong. The poison started taking effect on Ben, and he had to quit his job. He became everything that Sandra wanted. He withdrew from his friends, stopped trying to get Alexia back, and even checked up on his family. People started suspecting what was going on, but Sandra had a perfect story ready to give anyone who asked. Alexia cheated on Ben and it broke him, and she was trying her best to bring him back to life. Although the story sounded sketchy, it was quite plausible. After all, Alexia had moved out of her house. Things went on like this until Alexia decided to win her husband back. She was discontent with the state of Ben's health and how Sandra hovered around him like a bee, but she was willing to do anything to get her husband back. So, she started visiting him, bringing him homemade food and talking about getting back together. Alexia's actions made Sandra even more angry. Ben was becoming her man, and with Alexia in the picture, things could go wrong at any moment. And she hated that, because it meant that her story wouldn't be perfect. She started telling Ben untrue things about his wife, and this instigated fights between them. Alexia's pleasant visits became angry ones, and this made Sandra happy. She was sure that after a while, Ben would get tired of fighting Alexia and file for divorce. Then he would become hers totally. But much to her surprise, Ben and Alexia got along again. Their chemistry was undeniable, and the love they shared over time was rekindled. Ben started spending more time away from Sandra to be with his wife. He avoided her at social gatherings and even started working from home to avoid seeing her physically. Sandra became furious, angry, and hurt that Ben was becoming imperfect. He was no longer under her control like he used to be, and she hated it. Soon, she came up with a plan to finally put an end to Ben and Alexia's marriage. She stopped talking to Ben and tried becoming friends with Alexia. She invited Alexia for lunch at her store and even got her apology gifts for coming between she and Ben. Alexia was a sweet person. She accepted Alexia's apologies, failing to see that under the smiling and sunny personality, there was a demon beneath waiting to be unleashed. Her friendship with Alexia blossomed, and soon she was giving her advice on how to win her husband back totally and how to make him recover from his illness. She gave Alexia poisonous herbs in disguise as natural remedies, and the unsuspecting Alexia used them for her husband, not knowing that she was killing him slowly. After all, if she could not have him, then nobody would. Sandra expected things to move along quickly, but it seemed like nothing would happen, so she took the bull by the horns and decided to end it herself. 5:30 a.m., May 16th, 2023. Sandra invited Alexia over for some chicken pies that she knew Ben loved, and Alexia had gone to visit her at her home, unsuspecting of the danger she was getting into. She had never been to Sandra's apartment, so when she got in, she looked around her house, admiring and commenting on the beautiful works of art displayed in her home. Meanwhile, Sandra was carefully going over her plans again while covering up with a deceptive smile. She looked so happy that I was helping her, like she had gotten rid of the enemy, Sandra said during an interview. I was willing to take things slow with her, but she kept talking about how amazing Ben is to her, how caring and perfect he is despite his declining state of health. She wouldn't stop, and I got angry. But I wasn't going to show her. According to reports from the investigation, Alexia had gone through a phase of trauma when she moved away from home, and living together with Ben made her feel like she was falling in love again, hence the reason she couldn't stop talking about him. Unfortunately, Alexia didn't know that talking about her husband would lead her to her death, and she thought Sandra was a friend she could talk to. So, when she was offered tea by her friend, she took it with a big smile on her face. That smile would be her last. Unknown to her, the tea had been laced with the same poisonous herb she had been giving to Ben, but this time in a larger quantity. It would not kill her immediately, but keep her alive to witness the horror that would happen to her. Sandra realized that the poison had kicked in, and Alexia was lying half dead on the ground. She brought out her sharpest knife and other cutting tools and started by chopping off Alexia's limbs. She did this so meticulously that by the time she was through, she had been able to separate Alexia's limbs and other body parts from her organs. So, Alexia laid there at her friend's house, chopped into pieces. In order to make things perfect, Sandra decided to cook Alexia's limbs and put her organs in a plastic bag inside her refrigerator. She washed the entire house and got rid of all the bloodstains. After doing that, She waited for it to get dark before taking the chopped limbs outside her house. She dug a hole behind her garden and buried Alexia's chopped body there. She went on her day normally, acting like nothing happened until she got a call from the police department that something suspicious had been found in her backyard. Apparently, a stray dog caught a whiff of the buried body and dug it up. The neighbors were shocked to find human limbs in Alexia's house, and one of them had called the police. Sandra wasn't as perfect as she thought. She had forgotten to wash the cup she used in serving Alexia the poisonous tea. So when the detectives entered her house to investigate, they found remnants of the poison in the cup and DNA that showed that Alexis actually drank from the cup. I always suspected she was crazy with the way she was always smiling and acting happy, one of her neighbors said. The detectives also found the knives she had used in killing Alexia, and by the time she would confess to her crimes, Ben had gotten a heart attack and passed away 2 days after his wife. As the investigation became deeper, the detectives found out that Sandra had a hidden room where she planned everything she would do from the start. They found dead animals in the room, and according to them, she took a long time to practice on the animals before actually killing Alexia. The careful research she did to find the perfect poison to use, and her sick, obsessive thoughts of Ben were found in a journal in the room. On January 26, 2024, Sandra Miller was sentenced to 20 years of imprisonment without the possibility of parole or amnesty. According to the judge, Sandra was a maniac who should not be allowed back into society. Benita Jones, who was Alexia's sister, said while speaking in an interview, "When she moved out of her house with Ben and moved in with me, I knew something was wrong, but she wouldn't tell me. She acted like she was just taking a break from her marriage, and I didn't see anything wrong with that. If I had known, I would totally not have let her return to him." Sandra's sister, Abigail, who was present at the court, spoke to reporters about Sandra's obsessive behavior. "She had always been obsessive over things since we were kids. If she didn't get a doll she wanted, she would destroy the other ones she had until she got the one she desired." Zach also testified against her in court. "She always wanted to be perfect, to stand out, but whenever things don't go her way, she will ruin other things just to build her perfection. It is quite sad that Alexia had to lose her life to this obsessive, perfectionist murderer." In the final interview Sandra did before going to jail, she was asked if she regretted her actions, especially since she lost Ben. She thought about it for a while, and with a smile on her face, she replied, "Maybe, just maybe. Want to see more like this? Then click on the video you are seeing on your screen now." Agrees with Julia, but Daniel's reaction had been explosive, fueled by jealousy and rage. Kelvin hesitated. Then, realizing Julia needed help, he cautiously approached her. Without saying much, he gently helped her to her feet and guided her to a nearby bench. She was visibly shaken, her face streaked with tears, and her body still trembling from the assault. Kelvin's heart ached for her, but he knew there was little he could do at that moment. After ensuring she was seated and somewhat composed, he quietly excused himself and left the park, not wanting to intrude any further on her pain. Julia remained seated for a while, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened. The man she had once thought of as a refuge from her loneliness had now become the source of her deepest anguish. The relationship that had started with such passion and excitement had turned into something dark and destructive. The love that had once filled her life with joy had morphed into an obsession that left her bruised and broken, both physically and emotionally. The reality of her situation was undeniable. She could no longer continue this toxic relationship with Daniel. After what felt like hours, Julia finally found the strength to stand up and make her way home. Each step was heavy, not just from the physical pain, but from the weight of the emotional burden she carried. Her mind was made up. She knew she had to end things with Daniel, to put a stop to the violence and regain control of her life. As she walked home, the sun began to set, casting long shadows on the ground. The cool evening air did little to soothe the turmoil within her. Her decision to confront Daniel was firm, but that didn't make it any easier. She knew that ending the relationship was the only way to save herself, but the thought of facing Daniel one last time filled her with dread. When Julia arrived at her house, she took a moment to gather herself. The quiet of her home contrasted sharply with the chaos in her mind. She knew what she had to do. With renewed determination, she made her way to Daniel's apartment. The walk was short, but it felt like an eternity, each step bringing her closer to the confrontation she had been dreading. Without knocking, Julia opened the door to Daniel's apartment and stepped inside. The familiar scent of his cooking filled the air, a reminder of the times they had spent together. But those memories were tainted now, overshadowed by the violence and pain that had come to define their relationship. Daniel was in the kitchen, seemingly unaware of her arrival, engrossed in preparing a meal. The sight of him, so calm and focused, only reinforced Julia's resolve. She had to end this now, before it consumed her completely. There was no room for apologies or explanations. This was the end. Julia knew that walking away was the only option left. Her decision had been made, and she was determined to follow through, no matter how difficult it would be. As she left Daniel's apartment, the door closing behind her, a heavy silence settled in. Daniel, still in the kitchen, was left in stunned disbelief. The abruptness of it all had taken him by surprise. His world, once centered around his intense relationship with Julia, was now crumbling. The love affair that had been the focus of his life was over, ended in a moment of clarity and finality. Julia's departure marked the end of a chapter that had been filled with passion, but marred by obsession and violence. Daniel was left alone to face the reality of what he had lost, the echoes of her final departure lingering in the air. As the weeks went by, life seemed to return to normal for Julia. She went about her daily routine, relieved to be free from the toxic relationship that had once consumed her. The decision to end things with Daniel had been difficult, but it was the right choice. However, unbeknownst to her, Daniel's mind was unraveling. The thought of losing Julia had driven him to the brink of madness. His obsession with her, once masked as love, had now fully revealed itself as a dangerous fixation. He could not accept that Julia was no longer his, and the thought of her living a life without him gnawed at him relentlessly. One fateful day, unable to contain his spiraling thoughts any longer, Daniel made a decision that would shatter both of their lives. He walked into his kitchen, his eyes wild with a mix of anger, pain, and desperation. He reached for a knife, its cold metal handle firm in his grip, and without a second thought, he left his apartment and headed toward Julia's. His movements were mechanical, driven by a singular, dark purpose. As he made his way through the neighborhood, a few neighbors noticed the knife in his hand and the unsettling look on his face. Sensing that something was terribly wrong, they quickly called the police, hoping to intervene before it was too late. But time was not on Julia's side. Daniel, driven by his obsession, reached her apartment before the authorities could arrive. He burst through her door, his face contorted with a twisted mix of fury and anguish. Julia, caught off guard, looked up in horror as she saw the knife in his hand. She pleaded with him, her voice trembling as she begged for her life, but her words fell on deaf ears. Daniel was beyond reason. His mind had snapped, and all that remained was the overwhelming compulsion to make sure that if he couldn't have Julia, no one else could. Julia tried to escape, running through her apartment in a desperate attempt to flee from Daniel's madness. Her screams echoed through the walls, a haunting cry for help that would go unanswered. Daniel pursued her relentlessly, his eyes fixed on his target, his grip tightening on the knife. The chase was short but terrifying, with Julia desperately trying to find a way out. But there was no escape. Daniel, fueled by his obsession, finally caught up with her. In a frenzied rage, he stabbed her repeatedly, each blow driven by the twisted belief that this was the only way to keep her forever. As Julia's life ebbed away, Daniel stood over her lifeless body, panting and trembling with adrenaline. The reality of what he had just done began to sink in, but it was too late. The love that had once brought them together had now ended in unspeakable tragedy. The apartment, once a place of warmth and intimacy, was now a scene of horror. Blood stained the floors, and the air was thick with the scent of violence. Daniel's breaths came in ragged gasps as he stared down at Julia's lifeless form, the gravity of his actions starting to seep into his consciousness. At that moment, the sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder as the police arrived. The door to the apartment was kicked open, and officers stormed in, their guns drawn. They found Daniel standing over Julia's body, the knife still in his hand. His eyes were vacant, his mind numb to the chaos around him. The police quickly subdued him, pulling him away from the grisly scene. As they handcuffed him and led him out of the apartment, Daniel offered no resistance. His once fiery obsession had burned out, leaving nothing but emptiness in its wake. The news of Julia's murder spread quickly through the community, sending shockwaves of grief and fear. The once peaceful neighborhood was now overshadowed by the brutal crime, and the residents struggled to come to terms with the loss of a life that had been so tragically cut short. Julia's death became the focal point of countless conversations, with everyone trying to understand how such a horrific event could have happened in their midst. Daniel's trial was swift and widely covered in the media. The details of the crime were laid bare for all to see, painting a chilling picture of a man whose obsession had driven him to commit an unspeakable act. The courtroom was packed with spectators, all eager to witness the outcome of the trial. Daniel sat in silence throughout, his expression devoid of emotion. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the jury quickly reached a unanimous verdict of guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a fate that seemed almost merciful compared to the horrors he had inflicted on Julia. In the aftermath of the trial, the community was left to grapple with the lingering impact of Julia's murder. The park where the two had often been seen together became a somber reminder of the life that had been stolen. Neighbors spoke of Julia with a mix of sorrow and guilt, wondering if there had been any signs they had missed, any way they could have intervened before it was too late. The once vibrant social gatherings now felt subdued, overshadowed by the memory of the violence that had shattered their sense of safety. Daniel's arrest and subsequent imprisonment brought some measure of justice, but it could not erase the pain and loss that Julia's family and friends felt. Her death left a void that could never be filled, and the scars of that day would linger in the hearts of those who knew her. The story of Daniel and Julia became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how love, when twisted by obsession, can lead to the darkest of places. What happens when a seemingly perfect suburban life is shattered by a forbidden affair? Discover the hidden truth behind the housewife's relationship with her neighbor's son and the deadly consequences that followed. Lakeside was a quaint suburban neighborhood celebrated for its manicured lawns, charming houses, and tranquil atmosphere. It was a place where families felt secure, children played in the streets, and neighbors exchanged friendly greetings over white picket fences. Yet, beneath this veneer of perfection, an unsettling drama was brewing. Claire Patterson, a 37-year-old housewife, was at the heart of the story. Born in 1987 in a bustling city, Claire had always dreamed of a quieter, suburban life. She married Mark Patterson, a successful lawyer who was frequently away due to his demanding career. Mark, age 43, graduated from Harvard Law School and came from a well-established family with deep roots in the legal profession. His career success kept him busy, often leaving Claire to manage their home and care for their two young children, Amanda and Sam, alone. Claire's daily routine revolved around the needs of her family and maintaining their home. But as time went on, she grew increasingly dissatisfied with the monotony. The vibrant woman she once was seemed to fade under the weight of her predictable domestic life, and she began yearning for a sense of purpose and excitement. The Patterson family moved to Lakeside years ago, enticed by its reputation as an ideal place to raise children. While the move initially fulfilled their desires for a safe and pleasant environment, Claire soon found herself feeling trapped in a life she no longer enjoyed. Next door lived the Harrisons, a family deeply entrenched in the community. Jack Harrison, a retired engineer born in 1961, and his wife Melissa, born in 1964, were well known for their friendliness and community involvement. Jack had worked for a major engineering firm before retiring, and Melissa had spent many years as a part-time librarian. Their son, Josh Harrison, had recently turned 21. Born and raised in Lakeside, Josh felt like an outsider in his own neighborhood. Despite his parents' active involvement in local events, Josh had always preferred solitude. He excelled academically, earning top grades and showing a keen interest in technology, but struggled with social interactions. His classmates respected his intelligence but found it difficult to connect with him due to his reserved demeanor. At home, Josh's relationship with his parents was courteous but distant. They loved him, but couldn't fully understand his introverted nature and solitary interests. The contrasting lives of the Pattersons and Harrisons created a backdrop for the dramatic events that were about to unfold in their seemingly peaceful neighborhood. On a humid summer afternoon, while pruning her rose bushes, Claire noticed Josh working on his car. Shirtless and sweating, he tightened bolts under the hood. Claire watched him with detached curiosity. There was something about his focused, determined movements that captured her attention. Claire approached the fence separating their yards, her steps purposeful. She saw an opportunity to offer help, driven by a maternal instinct. With a warm smile, she called out to Josh, offering assistance with his car. Josh looked up, surprised. He wiped his hands and managed a hesitant smile, his shyness evident as he politely declined her offer. Despite his refusal, Claire suggested bringing him a cold drink. Josh accepted, and Claire went inside to get lemonade. Returning with 2 glasses, Claire handed one to Josh. They stood together, sipping their drinks in a moment of quiet companionship. Claire reflected on how much Josh had changed since her family moved in. Once a lively boy, he now seemed weary and distant. Josh's demeanor revealed a subtle shift in his mood. He appeared burdened, avoiding direct eye contact. Sensing this, Claire felt compassion and offered him a listening ear, knowing the value of talking to someone outside one's immediate family. Josh was taken aback by Claire's genuine concern. Though he initially downplayed his feelings, he recognized the sincerity in her offer and thanked her. The interaction forged a new understanding between them, easing Josh's troubles, even if just slightly. Over the following weeks, Claire and Josh frequently crossed paths. They shared brief chats over the fence and coffee on Claire's porch. Their conversations, initially light and mundane, grew more personal. Josh began to open up about his struggles and uncertainties about the future, while Claire shared her frustrations with her life and marriage. For Claire, these interactions were a lifeline, a reminder that she was still desirable. For Josh, Claire became a confidant, a safe place in a world that felt overwhelming. Their connection grew stronger, blurring the lines between friendship and something more. One late August afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows, Claire and Josh sat on the porch sharing a bottle of wine. Mark was away on a business trip, and the kids were at a friend's house, leaving Claire and Josh alone. Josh expressed his fears about his future, feeling lost and uncertain. Claire, sensing his distress, moved closer and gently placed her hand on his, offering comfort. She reassured him that he had time to find his path, her words meant to soothe his anxiety. Josh's vulnerability was evident as he admitted his fear of remaining stuck in a rut. Claire, confident in his potential, affirmed his intelligence and talents. Her encouragement offered Josh a glimmer of hope, though the words between them were heavy with unspoken meaning. As they gazed at each other, Josh felt a pull toward Claire. He leaned in and kissed her. Claire was initially shocked, but then responded, driven by a desperate longing to feel alive again. Their kiss, intense and consuming, broke down the barriers of guilt and consequences. After pulling apart, both were breathless. Claire's mind raced with thoughts of what she had done. Despite her inner turmoil, she couldn't regret the moment. Josh's apology was cut short by Claire's kiss, and she admitted that she couldn't stop. Claire and Josh's affair began that night. Their affair quickly became a series of secret meetings. Josh, after school, would delay going home, making excuses to stay out. He would sneak out of his house at night, avoiding his parents to meet Claire. They often met at Claire's house when Mark was away. Claire would set the scene with dim lights and soft music, creating a private space for them. Josh would text Claire when he was on his way, ensuring the house was ready for their rendezvous. Their secret meetings also took place in Josh's car, parked in quiet spots. The car became their private retreat, where they would talk and embrace without fear of being seen. Claire would share her frustrations about her marriage, and Josh would open up about feeling isolated. Their meetings were filled with passion and deep conversations, but the constant need to hide took its toll. They lived in a constant state of anxiety, trying to keep their affair hidden while dealing with the emotional weight of their secret relationship. However, Claire's guilt grew as she continued the affair. Every interaction with Mark and the children felt like a weight on her chest. Though she knew it was wrong, she couldn't end the relationship. The connection with Josh was unlike anything she had experienced, and she feared losing it. Josh's initial excitement about his affair with Claire soon gave way to unease. Although he loved her, the reality of their situation, Claire being married, became increasingly clear. The secrecy and lies took a heavy toll on him. Claire, too, struggled with the affair's impact on her life. Her relationship with Mark grew colder as her guilt became more apparent. She pulled away from him, creating tension in their marriage. Mark, noticing the distance and emotional detachment, tried to reconnect, but Claire's walls grew higher, leaving him confused and hurt. Josh's academic performance deteriorated as he became consumed by his feelings for Claire. His grades dropped, and his once strong focus on schoolwork faded. He stopped engaging in class and avoided extracurricular activities, pulling away from friends and hobbies. The stress of the affair clouded his thoughts, and he felt increasingly isolated. Claire faced similar problems. The guilt of her deception affected her daily life. Her stress and emotional turmoil made her withdraw from her family, adding to the strain of keeping the affair secret. Both were trapped in a cycle of regret and secrecy, deeply affected by their choices, but unable to escape the consequences. The breaking point came in late September, as autumn's chill swept through Lakeside. Claire and Josh met at their usual secluded spot. Josh felt a sense of dread as he approached, sensing something was wrong. Claire was already there, her face etched with fear and sadness. She told Josh that she couldn't continue the affair. It was overwhelming her and tearing her apart. Her voice trembled as she explained that she needed to end things to restore some semblance of normalcy in her life. Josh's heart sank. He was overcome with a mix of shock and desperation. He begged Claire not to leave him, his pleas filled with anguish. He tried to reason with her, promising to change and assuring her that they could work things out. His words were desperate and filled with raw emotion. But Claire remained resolute. Claire, tears in her eyes, made the painful decision to drive away. She started her car and left Josh standing alone, his world crumbling around him. As her car disappeared from view, Josh felt a profound sense of abandonment and grief. In the days that followed, Josh's despair grew. He stopped going to school and withdrew from friends, consumed by the hope that Claire might come back. This hope soon turned into anger and resentment, clouding his mind and poisoning his thoughts. His once bright future seemed dim, overshadowed by the loss of Claire and the chaos their affair had caused. One night, Josh snapped. Unable to accept Claire's departure, he decided to confront her. The night was crisp and clear when Josh left his own house and hurried over to Claire Patterson's home. Their relationship had ended weeks prior, and Claire had not expected Josh to visit. The two houses were only a few doors apart in their quiet neighborhood. As he walked swiftly along the dimly lit street, the weight of his actions pressed heavily on his shoulders. Claire was at home, her husband Mark away on a business trip. The house was quiet, save for the soft glow of the television in the living room. Claire, dressed in comfy pajamas and with her hair tied up in a loose bun, was watching a rerun of a familiar sitcom. She was trying to distract herself from the chaos and guilt of the past weeks, but her serenity was shattered by Josh's unexpected visit. Josh arrived unannounced, catching Claire off guard. The atmosphere inside the house was eerily serene, with the television's light flickering against the walls. Claire looked up, startled by his sudden intrusion. Their previous interactions had been filled with tension and unresolved emotions, and this night was no different. Claire, still grappling with the decision to end their relationship, was visibly anxious. She had hoped that the breakup would bring closure, but Josh's sudden appearance threw her into a state of panic. Their conversation, initially calm, quickly escalated. Josh, unable to accept the end of their affair, pleaded with Claire to reconsider. His desperation grew into frustration and anger. Josh's anger overwhelmed him as he confronted Claire, blinding him to everything but his rage. She struggled desperately to break free from his grip, her heart pounding in terror. But his hands held her tightly, fueled by a fury that drowned out any reason. Claire pleaded, her voice trembling, calling out to him repeatedly, begging him to listen, but her words fell on deaf ears. Josh was too consumed by his wrath to hear her cries, his anger too far gone for any words to calm him. As Claire continued to plead, Josh's response was chilling. He spat out his words with cold determination, insisting that she couldn't just leave him, that they were stuck together, bound in a way that she couldn't escape. Despite her growing desperation, Claire insisted that it had to stop, that she couldn't continue living like this. Yet Josh's resolve only hardened, his mind set on not letting her go. The tension reached its breaking point as Claire, still struggling, managed to hit Josh, momentarily loosening his grip. She seized the chance and broke free, sprinting towards her room, her breath ragged with fear. But Josh was right behind her, his voice echoing through the house with a terrifying promise. He vowed that no matter where she went, he would find her. Panic surged through Claire as she tried to shut the door, but before she could secure it, Josh forced his way inside. In the small confines of the room, the terror in Claire's eyes was unmistakable as Josh advanced on her. She backed away in desperation, but his hands found her throat once more. Claire gasped for air, her hands clawing at his, trying with all her fading strength to free herself. She choked out desperate pleas for him to stop, but Josh's anger had stripped him of reason. He was beyond hearing, beyond seeing anything but his need to control her. As Claire's strength waned, her struggles weakened until she went limp in his grasp. For a moment, Josh believed she was pretending, playing a cruel trick on him. He continued to speak, his words a twisted mix of love and anger, assuring her that they would be together no matter what. But when no response came, a terrible realization dawned on him. He reached out with trembling hands to check her pulse and was struck by the cold truth. Claire was dead. Horror washed over him, and he staggered back, leaning against the wall as the weight of his actions settled on him. His mind raced, trying to process what he had done. Panic overtook him as he frantically considered his options. Desperate, he arranged Claire's body on the bed, trying to make it appear as though she had passed out while sleeping. With his heart pounding and guilt gnawing at his soul, Josh fled to his room, leaving behind the lifeless body of the woman he had once loved. Once back in his room, Josh was consumed by an overwhelming need to cleanse himself of the night's events. He rushed into the shower, scrubbing his skin with frantic intensity, desperate to wash away the sweat and grime of what he had just done. His hands trembled as he tried to purge the sense of suffocation that clung to him, but no amount of water could cleanse the deep-seated guilt that weighed on his mind. The memory of Claire's lifeless body haunted him, refusing to be washed away. After the shower, he collapsed onto his bed, his thoughts a chaotic storm of fear and regret, unable to escape the reality of his actions. Josh's thoughts were a jumble of regret and panic as he lay there. He knew he couldn't stay in his house forever. The reality of his crime began to sink in, and he struggled to come to terms with the enormity of his actions. He knew he had to find a way to escape the inevitable consequences that awaited him. As dawn broke, Josh decided to leave. He drove aimlessly, hoping that the act of moving would somehow distance him from the gravity of his crime. The once familiar streets of Lakeside now seemed alien, filled with shadows that seemed to whisper his guilt. He ended up in a remote part of town, far from the community that had once been his home. The quiet countryside offered a brief respite from the chaos in his mind, but it did nothing to alleviate the crushing burden of his actions. Back in Lakeside, the Patterson household was waking up to a day that would forever change their lives. Mark Patterson returned from his business trip, eager to reunite with his family. As he approached his home, he noticed the unusual quietness. The kids were still at their grandparents', and Claire was supposed to be at home. The absence of his wife quickly turned into alarm as he entered the house and found it eerily still. When Mark returned home, he immediately noticed something was off. The front door was ajar, which puzzled him. Claire would never have left the house unsecured. A sense of unease settled over him as he stepped inside, calling her name, but there was no response. He searched through the house, checking each room, but Claire was nowhere to be found. Confusion turned into concern as he made his way to the bedroom. Entering the room, Mark's worry began to ease when he saw Claire lying on the bed. At first, he thought she was simply asleep, and a soft smile touched his lips as he imagined waking her up to share stories about his trip. He started to undress, ready to settle in and talk, calling her name a few more times, but she didn't stir. After several attempts to wake her with no response, Mark's concern deepened. He moved closer, intending to shake her gently awake, but as he leaned over her, a cold dread gripped him. Claire wasn't breathing. He reached out to check her pulse, his fingers trembling, and that's when the full horror struck him. Claire was dead. Mark stood there, frozen in shock, unable to comprehend what had happened. The room that once felt warm and familiar now felt cold and distant, the silence around him heavy with grief. The police were called, and an investigation into Claire's death began immediately. Detectives arrived at the scene, noting the unsettling details. While there were no signs of a violent struggle, the open doors and the way Claire was found raised suspicions. Forensic experts carefully examined the room, searching for any clues that could explain her sudden death. As the investigation unfolded, attention quickly turned to Josh. His sudden disappearance from town and increasingly erratic behavior caught the eyes of the authorities. The police began piecing together the timeline, and it didn't take long for them to connect Josh to the events leading up to Claire's death. They discovered a key piece of evidence: Claire's phone, which had been found discarded in a nearby trash bin. The last messages and calls were all to Josh, revealing a heated argument that matched the time frame of her death. Josh's clothes, though seemingly clean, had been hastily washed, and traces of fibers matching those from Claire's bedding were found. His frantic efforts to cover his tracks, combined with his sudden disappearance, provided the final pieces of the puzzle. The authorities now had enough evidence to link him to the crime, making Josh the prime suspect in Claire's death. As the investigation intensified, the search for Josh became a top priority. The police scoured the town, questioning his friends and family, hoping to track down his whereabouts. His parents were distraught, unable to explain their son's sudden disappearance. They insisted they hadn't seen him since the day of the incident, and their growing anxiety only fueled the authorities' determination to find him. Days passed, and the tension in the town grew. The police extended their search, following every possible lead until they finally located Josh hiding out in a motel on the outskirts of town. His disheveled appearance and nervous demeanor made it clear that he had been on the run. He was arrested without incident, his capture bringing a sense of relief and dread to the community. With Josh in custody, the evidence began to stack up. Claire's phone, discarded in a nearby trash bin, revealed the final heated exchange between her and Josh. The fibers found on Josh's hastily washed clothes matched those from Claire's bedding, further implicating him in her death. The courtroom was packed with spectators, their faces a mix of curiosity, disbelief, and sadness. The trial of Josh, accused of murdering Claire Patterson, had captivated the local community. As the proceedings unfolded, the reality of the crime began to unravel in a way that no one had anticipated. The evidence presented painted a chilling picture, and the community watched in shock as the truth about that tragic night was laid bare. Josh's confession came as a chilling revelation during the trial. Under intense questioning, Josh broke down and admitted to killing Claire. His voice trembled as he recounted the events of that fateful night. With tears streaming down his face, he detailed their tumultuous relationship, how they had been involved in a secret affair, and the devastating moment Claire decided to end things. Josh's confession was raw and emotional, reflecting the turmoil that had consumed him since the breakup. He described how their affair had started with intense passion, but had quickly become a source of immense strain and guilt. Despite knowing their relationship was wrong, Josh had been unable to let go when Claire chose to end it. The weight of their illicit romance and the sudden rupture of their bond pushed him into a state of emotional chaos. His inability to cope with Claire's decision led to the tragic outburst of violence. Josh's revelation stunned everyone in the courtroom. The admission was not just a confession of murder, but also a shock to those who had been unaware of the affair. His parents, Harrison and Margaret Taylor, were among the most affected. They had been completely in the dark about their son's relationship with Claire. For them, the trial was not just about the crime, but also about the shocking betrayal of their trust. They had known Josh as a quiet, reserved young man, unaware of the hidden complexities of his life. The disclosure of his affair with Claire was a brutal awakening. and they struggled to reconcile their image of him with the gravity of his actions. Mark Patterson, Claire's husband, was equally blindsided. He had been focused on grieving the loss of his wife and trying to piece together the fragments of his shattered life. Learning that Claire had been involved in an affair with Josh, a neighbor and someone he had never suspected, added a layer of betrayal and pain. Mark's anguish was compounded by the realization that the man who had caused his family's devastation was someone so close to him. The trial concluded with Josh being convicted of Claire's murder. Rumors about the affair spread like wildfire. The details of Josh and Claire's relationship, the reasons behind their breakup, and the tragic outcome were dissected and discussed at length. Gossip columns and local news outlets amplified the story, turning the personal tragedy into a sensational headline. The community's response was a blend of disbelief and condemnation. People who had known Claire and Josh in different contexts now viewed them through the lens of the scandal that had unfolded. The verdict was a somber moment for the community of Lakeside. The once peaceful neighborhood was left grappling with the shock of the tragedy and the irreversible impact on the Patterson family. Josh's life was irrevocably altered, and the community was forever changed by the brutal crime that unfolded in their midst. In the heart of Maplewood, a seemingly perfect life disintegrated into chaos and bloodshed. What began as a hidden affair between a married man and his sister-in-law ended in a night of explosive confrontation and murder. How did a seemingly idyllic town become the backdrop for such a horrific betrayal? What drove Rebecca Parker to the edge of sanity, leading to a devastating act of violence? Rebecca Parker and Emily Collins grew up in the charming town of Maplewood, surrounded by green parks and cozy shops. Their parents worked hard to meet daily needs, but were always determined to give their children a good education. This loving and supportive environment helped shape Rebecca and Emily's strong family bonds. Rebecca, born in 1976, was known for her sense of responsibility and ambition. Her parents' hard work inspired her to excel in school and in the community. She became a role model in Maplewood, achieving great academic success and participating in local activities. Rebecca earned a scholarship to Harvard University and followed a clear path: get a degree, build a career, and start a family. Emily Collins, born in 1984, took a different path. In high school, she loved the arts and humanities. At college, she excelled in creative writing and art. Emily's creative talents and involvement in student groups showed her unique skills and love for different perspectives. In her 20s, Emily tried various jobs and relationships, but struggled to find stability. Despite their differences, Rebecca supported Emily as much as she could. Their relationship was loving but had its tensions. Rebecca felt proud but also frustrated by Emily's lack of direction, while Emily envied Rebecca's success. Rebecca enjoyed the structured life in Maplewood, while Emily sought excitement and change. Daniel Parker, born in 1974, is the husband of Rebecca Parker. Growing up in a modest family in a neighboring town, Daniel's early life was marked by a strong work ethic and a keen interest in finance. After completing his studies in finance at a state university, Daniel built a successful career as a financial advisor, known for his meticulous and analytical skills. His professional achievements led him to Maplewood, where he met Rebecca at a local charity event. Their shared values and mutual respect quickly deepened into a committed relationship, culminating in a marriage celebrated by their close-knit community. The town of Maplewood, with its neatly trimmed lawns, Victorian architecture, and close-knit community, was a picturesque and lively place where everyone knew everyone, and gatherings like the annual Maplewood Festival were cherished traditions. In this idyllic setting, Daniel and Rebecca Parker were admired as the epitome of success and grace. Their marriage often envied and held up as an example of perfection within the community. However, beyond the facade of perfection, as weeks passed by, Daniel and Rebecca's marriage had begun to show signs of strain. The initial spark that had brought them together was fading, and they were struggling to maintain the closeness they once had. Daniel, in particular, felt restless and unfulfilled. His job was demanding, and he often felt the pressure to provide the kind of life he believed Rebecca deserved. Emily, the younger sister of Rebecca, called, informing her that she would be returning to Maplewood. Rebecca was thrilled about the news and eagerly shared it with Daniel. They both felt a sense of excitement at the prospect of having Emily close again. When Emily moved back to Maplewood, she chose an apartment close to Rebecca and Daniel's home. Her arrival was warmly welcomed, and the three of them often spent time together, enjoying dinners, movie nights, and weekend outings. To the outside world, they appeared to be a happy, close-knit family. However, beneath the surface, things were not as perfect as they seemed. Emily's return added a new dynamic to their lives. She was lively and free-spirited, bringing a breath of fresh air into their routine. Daniel found himself drawn to her energy and spontaneity, qualities he felt were missing from his life with Rebecca. Emily, too, was charmed by Daniel's attention. He was attentive, flattering, and seemed genuinely interested in her stories and experiences. At first, their interactions were innocent enough: friendly conversations, shared jokes, and occasional outings without Rebecca. But as time went on, the attraction between Daniel and Emily grew stronger. They began to find excuses to spend time alone, and what started as a harmless friendship soon developed into something more serious. Rebecca, busy with her teaching and community activities, didn't notice the growing bond between her sister and her husband. She trusted them both completely and had no reason to suspect that anything was amiss. She was happy to see Daniel and Emily getting along so well, believing it would strengthen their family ties. As the months passed, however, subtle changes began to surface. Daniel started coming home later than usual, explaining it away with work commitments. Emily, too, became more secretive about her whereabouts and activities. There were moments of awkwardness and tension that Rebecca couldn't quite put her finger on. Despite the warning signs, Rebecca remained blissfully unaware of the affair. Her love for Daniel and her sister blinded her to the possibility of betrayal. She continued to go about her daily life, confident that her marriage and her family were solid and secure. Meanwhile, the relationship between Daniel and Emily deepened. What had started as a forbidden romance was quickly turning into an obsession. Daniel was captivated by Emily's vivaciousness and felt a renewed sense of excitement and adventure. Emily, in turn, felt a thrill in the illicit nature of their relationship, even as she grappled with guilt and fear of discovery. The affair took a toll on both of them. Daniel became increasingly distant and irritable, struggling to balance his feelings for Emily with his responsibilities to Rebecca. Emily, caught between her love for her sister and her passion for Daniel, found herself in a constant state of turmoil. She knew that what they were doing was wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to end it. As the affair continued, Daniel, Emily, and Rebecca's lives became more complicated. For a while, it seemed like they had found the perfect balance, keeping their secret hidden. Daniel spent time with Rebecca, pretending to be a loving husband, while secretly meeting Emily. However, as the months passed, subtle changes began to surface. Emily's once cheerful personality changed. She became more withdrawn and anxious, constantly fearing the truth would come out. Rebecca noticed these changes but thought Emily was just adjusting to life back in Maplewood. She had no idea of the storm brewing underneath. As the days passed, Daniel's fixation on Emily deepened. He became enamored with the way she laughed during their beach outings, the way her eyes sparkled in the sunlight, and the effortless way she carried herself during their hikes. Every shared moment became an opportunity for him to imagine a different reality. The time they spent together, once a symbol of their familial closeness, now fueled his obsession. His thoughts were consumed by Emily, and he found himself daydreaming about her during work, unable to focus on anything but her. The intense, almost magnetic attraction he felt was slowly but surely tearing apart the life he had with Rebecca. The once simple, joyful activities now seemed tainted by his unrelenting thoughts of Emily, creating a rift in his marriage that was growing wider with each passing day. But soon, it became clear that Daniel's interest in Emily went beyond their agreement. He started showing up unannounced, demanding her time and attention. Emily, who had initially enjoyed the thrill of their secret meetings, began to feel trapped. She loved Daniel but was increasingly aware of the dangerous path they were on. The excitement was replaced by fear and uncertainty about what might happen next. Emily's fears were not unfounded. Daniel's obsession grew darker over time. He became possessive and jealous, questioning Emily about her interactions with other men. The thrill of their affair was replaced by a suffocating tension that Emily couldn't escape. She began to fear what might happen if she tried to end things with Daniel, knowing how unpredictable he had become. But she wasn't prepared for the drastic turn of events that would soon unfold. One evening, after a particularly heated argument with Rebecca, Daniel stormed out of the house and went straight to Emily's apartment. His mind was clouded with anger and desperation, and Emily could see that something had shifted. Daniel's once passionate love had turned into a dangerous obsession, and Emily was caught in the middle of a storm she couldn't control. The tension between them reached a boiling point. Daniel's dark thoughts consumed him, and he began to talk about drastic measures to be with Emily. The idea of leaving Rebecca was no longer enough. He wanted a more permanent solution, one that would free him from his marriage and allow him to be with Emily without fear of discovery. Emily, horrified by Daniel's dark turn, tried to reason with him. She pleaded with him to think about the consequences, to consider Rebecca's feelings and the impact it would have on their lives. But Daniel was beyond reason. His obsession had taken over, and he was willing to do whatever it took to be with Emily. Rebecca, caught in the middle of this growing conflict, tried to keep her family together. She reached out to Daniel, hoping to rekindle the love they once had. But Daniel's heart was no longer with her. His thoughts were consumed by Emily, and every interaction with Rebecca only pushed him further away. The interactions between Daniel and Emily became increasingly strained. Emily, feeling the weight of the affair, started to pull back. She couldn't continue living a lie, but she was afraid of what Daniel might do if she ended things. The fear of his reaction kept her trapped in a situation that was spiraling out of control. As the conflict developed, the stakes grew higher. Emily's fear and guilt consumed her, making her every interaction with Rebecca a painful reminder of her betrayal. Daniel's obsession turned darker, and his behavior became more erratic and unpredictable. The once harmless adventure had turned into a nightmare, and the consequences of their actions loomed large. The tension between them was like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. Every conversation, every glance, every action was filled with underlying conflict. The facade of normalcy was cracking, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. Emily's once strong bond with Rebecca had turned into a constant source of pain and guilt. She struggled to meet her sister's eyes, burdened by the betrayal she was concealing. The emotional toll was immense, with every pretense becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Guilt ate away at her, overshadowing her interactions and making each shared moment with Rebecca feel hollow. Every question about Daniel intensified her anxiety, deepening her internal conflict and causing a profound sense of isolation. The weight of her deception fractured her sense of self, leaving her overwhelmed and deeply distressed. As the affair continued, the tension between Daniel, Emily, and Rebecca grew more intense. Their interactions became fraught with underlying emotions and hidden motives. The balance they had managed to maintain began to crumble as the months passed. However, as the months passed, subtle changes began to surface. Daniel became more reckless, taking bigger risks to see Emily. His obsession with her was growing, and he was no longer content with their secret meetings. He wanted more. He wanted her all to himself. Emily, on the other hand, was becoming increasingly anxious. The thrill of their affair was overshadowed by the fear of getting caught. She was constantly looking over her shoulder, worried that someone would discover their secret. The weight of their betrayal was starting to take its toll on her. Rebecca, still oblivious to the affair, was growing more concerned about the changes in her husband and sister. She couldn't understand why Daniel was becoming more distant or why Emily seemed so on edge. She tried to reach out to both of them, hoping to bridge the growing gap in their relationships. But her efforts were in vain. Daniel and Emily were too consumed by their own guilt and fear to respond to Rebecca's attempts at reconciliation. As the tension grew, the cracks in their perfect lives began to appear. Rebecca noticed small but troubling signs that something was wrong. Inconsistencies in their stories, unusual behavior, and odd changes in their routines started to raise her suspicions. The trust she once had in Daniel and Emily slowly began to crumble. Instead of the warmth and love she was used to, Rebecca felt a cold distance between them. Each new oddity made her more doubtful and wary, and she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about the people closest to her. The inevitable confrontation came on a stormy night in Maplewood. The air was thick with tension, and the sound of thunder rumbled in the distance. Rebecca, unable to shake her suspicions any longer, decided to confront Daniel and Emily. She needed answers, and she was determined to get them. She arrived at Emily's apartment unannounced, her heart pounding in her chest. The scene that greeted her confirmed her worst fears. Daniel and Emily were together, their expressions a mix of shock and guilt as they saw Rebecca standing in the doorway. Rebecca's heart raced as she took in the sight before her. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within her. The betrayal she had never imagined was now undeniable. She felt a surge of anger and heartbreak, emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Rebecca's voice trembled as she demanded answers from Daniel and Emily. The tension in the room was palpable as years of repressed emotions and hidden resentments came flooding out. Rebecca's words cut through the silence, each one laced with pain and betrayal. She questioned how they could do this to her, how they could betray her trust so completely. Emily's eyes filled with tears as she tried to explain. She struggled to find the words to justify her actions, but nothing she said could ease Rebecca's pain. Daniel stood by, his expression one of guilt and regret. He knew there was no way to fix the damage that had been done. Rebecca's anger, a force of its own, seemed to envelop her entirely. In a moment of unrestrained fury, she grabbed a heavy candlestick from a nearby table and hurled it at Daniel. The candlestick flew through the air but missed its target, clattering against the wall behind him. Daniel, recognizing the danger, tried to close the distance between them, his voice rising as he attempted to reason with Rebecca. Despite his efforts to calm her, Rebecca's rage was uncontrollable. She advanced toward him, her eyes blazing with a mixture of hurt and fury. The argument grew more heated, Daniel's attempts to hold her still failing, as she was driven by an unrelenting need to be heard. As Daniel tried to grasp her shoulders and reason with her, Rebecca's anger only intensified. She quickly glanced at the candlestick that had fallen to the floor, her face contorted with rage. In a sudden, violent move, Rebecca reached down, picked up the candlestick, and with a forceful motion, struck Daniel directly on the head. The impact was brutal and immediate. Daniel staggered, his expression one of shock and pain, before collapsing onto the floor. Blood pooled around him as he lay motionless, his life rapidly slipping away. The room fell into a heavy silence, the gravity of the situation settling over Rebecca like a suffocating fog. Her rage dissolved into disbelief as she stared at Daniel's lifeless body. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she reached out to him. "Daniel! Daniel, please stand up!" she cried out, her voice cracking with desperation. But there was no response. Her pleas went unanswered, the silence of the room growing more profound with each passing second. Emily, who had been standing in stunned shock, slowly approached the scene. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mix of horror and disbelief. She hesitantly checked Daniel's pulse, her fingers trembling as they rested on his neck. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity as she confirmed what was already evident. There was no pulse, no sign of life. "Rebecca," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's dead. You killed him." The reality of Emily's words struck Rebecca like a physical blow. Her hands flew to her mouth in a gesture of horror as she looked at Daniel's lifeless body, her mind reeling from the enormity of what had just occurred. Panic set in, and the two women were left to confront the terrifying reality of their situation. Emily's eyes were filled with fear and accusation, her mind racing as she faced Rebecca. The urgency and the need to act drove Emily into a state of panic. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on her mind as she grappled with the immediate necessity of dealing with Daniel's lifeless body. Rebecca, too, was overtaken by fear, but her terror quickly transformed into a cold, calculated resolve. Her thoughts raced as she evaluated their dire predicament. Her voice, though trembling, carried a steely determination as she spoke. Hiding the body was the only option Rebecca could envision, overshadowed by the looming fear of imprisonment. The gravity of their predicament pressed down on them, pushing them to act with a desperate clarity. They dragged Daniel's body into a closet, attempting to conceal it as best as they could. Their movements were frantic, their fear palpable as they tried to figure out how to cover their tracks. They debated what to do next, their panic only adding to their confusion. The thought of calling for help crossed Emily's mind, but it was quickly overshadowed by Rebecca's vehement opposition. The fear of involving the police loomed large in Rebecca's mind. She argued that calling the authorities would seal their fate, their voices thick with desperation and practicality. The night wore on as the two women worked in tense silence, their actions driven by fear and desperation. They scrubbed at the bloodstains on the carpet, tried to erase any trace of their presence in the room, and kept a vigilant watch on the closet where Daniel's body was hidden. The weight of their crime pressed heavily on them, their fear growing with each passing hour. The following morning, the police arrived at the house, responding to a concerned neighbor's report of a commotion. Rebecca and Emily, now forced to confront the reality of their situation, were subjected to intense scrutiny. The investigators noted inconsistencies in their accounts and grew suspicious of their behavior. The discovery of Daniel's body in the closet was a devastating blow that shattered the illusion of normalcy Rebecca and Emily had tried so hard to maintain. The investigation unfolded with relentless thoroughness. Evidence was meticulously collected, and detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the events of that fateful night. Rebecca and Emily were questioned repeatedly, their stories scrutinized and dissected. As the investigation progressed, the truth about the night of Daniel's death began to emerge. The trial that followed was fraught with tension and emotion. The courtroom was filled with spectators, their eyes fixed on the dramatic proceedings. Rebecca and Emily faced serious charges, their defense attorneys struggling to present a case that could mitigate their culpability. The prosecution presented a damning case, detailing the violent altercation and the subsequent attempts to conceal the body. Witness testimonies, including those of neighbors who had heard the commotion, painted a stark picture of the events leading up to Daniel's death. During the trial, Rebecca and Emily's testimonies were marked by emotional strain. Rebecca fought to maintain her composure as she recounted the events of that night, her guilt and sorrow evident in her voice. Emily, too, struggled with her emotions, her eyes often cast down as she faced the weight of her actions. The courtroom was gripped by the drama of the trial, the emotional impact of the proceedings palpable to all who attended. Ultimately, both women were found guilty of their roles in Daniel's death. The verdict was a crushing blow, and the sentences they received were a harsh reminder of the consequences of their actions. The community of Maplewood, once enamored with the Parkers' perfect image, was left to grapple with the fallout of the tragedy. The town watched in somber silence as the lives of Rebecca and Emily were forever altered by their choices. In the aftermath of the trial, Rebecca and Emily faced the harsh reality of their new lives. Their days in prison were marked by the weight of their guilt and the isolation from a community that had once admired them. The glamorous life they had once enjoyed was now a distant memory, replaced by the stark and unforgiving reality of confinement. The story of Daniel's death became a cautionary tale, a somber reminder of how quickly things could unravel and the devastating consequences of allowing anger and betrayal to go unchecked.